The lecture hall was massive and white, stretching out like a giant bowl with seats arranged in perfect circles. Jake Morrison sat in the third row, his hands folded on the metal desk in front of him. The air smelled strange, like ozone mixed with something sweet that made his nose twitch. Around him sat creatures from dozens of different worlds, each one looking as uncomfortable as he felt. Jake was 34 years old, and had seen his share of strange places during his time as a Marine. But this was different. This was the Galactic Educational Consortium's flagship station, orbiting a planet called Kepler 442b. The station was huge, bigger than any city Jake had ever seen, and it floated in space like a metal moon. It was where newly contacted species came to learn about galactic law and customs. Before they could join the big club of spacefaring civilizations, he wore his best diplomatic uniform, navy blue with small silver buttons. The fabric felt stiff. Against his skin, nothing like the comfortable combat gear he preferred. Next to him sat Dr. Lisa Carter, a xenobiologist with brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She was busy taking notes on her tablet, her green eyes focused on the holographic display at the front of the room. On his other side was Captain Ben Parker, a Space Force pilot with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Ben was trying to look interested, but Jake could see him fighting back a yawn. They were part of humanity's first official delegation to the consortium. 3 humans representing all of Earth, sitting in a room full of aliens who had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on Jake's shoulders. At the front of the room stood their instructor, Zixtara. She was tall, maybe 7 feet, with blue skin that looked like polished metal. 4 arms moved gracefully as she spoke, each one ending in long fingers that tapered to sharp points. Her head was elongated, with 4 dark eyes arranged in a diamond pattern. When she spoke, her voice had a musical quality that might have been pleasant if not for the condescending tone she used for everything. Zixtara belonged to a species called the Altarians, one of the founding races of the consortium. They had been in space for over 10,000 years and never let anyone forget it. For 3 days now, she had been explaining to the primitive newcomers why their species were naturally inferior to the advanced races that ran the galactic government. Jake had listened to lectures about galactic history, trade regulations, and something called the Harmony Protocols. Each lesson came with the same message: the older species knew better, and the newer ones should be grateful for their guidance. The way Zixtara spoke, you would think the consortium was doing everyone a favor by letting them join. Today was different, though. Today's topic was specifically about humans, and Jake could feel his jaw getting tighter with each word that came out of the instructor's mouth. As we conclude our survey of newly contacted species, Zixtara said, her 4 arms gesturing at a holographic display showing Earth, we come to perhaps the most concerning case, humanity. The way she said the word made it sound like a disease. The display changed to show images of human cities, then shifted to pictures of wars throughout history. Jake saw flashes of ancient battles, then more recent conflicts, all presented without context or explanation. Just violence and destruction, as if that was all humans had ever accomplished. Humans are particularly unsuited for galactic society, Zixtara continued, one arm pointing at the images while another made notes on a floating tablet. Their aggression levels are off the charts compared to civilized species. They solve conflicts through violence rather than negotiation. Their technology is primitive, their lifespans laughably short, and their social structures are chaotic at best. Jake's hands clenched into fists on his desk. He had been in enough briefings to know when someone was cherry-picking facts to make a point, but this was different. This was personal. Dr. Carter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her pen clicking against her tablet. Jake knew she was thinking about all the medical advances humans had shared freely with other species, all the research collaborations that had helped solve problems across the galaxy. None of that was being mentioned. Captain Parker's face had gone red above his collar. Jake could see the pilot's hands shaking slightly as he gripped the edge of his desk. Ben had lost friends in the border wars, fighting to protect alien colonies from raiders. Those friends had died heroes, but apparently that did not matter to Zixtara. The holographic display now showed human military units in action, but instead of showing the context, the reasons for fighting, or the lives saved, it just showed the fighting itself. Explosions, weapons fire, and soldiers in combat gear. The narrator made it sound like humans enjoyed war for its own sake. Their military history is particularly disturbing, Zixtara said, her voice taking on a tone like she was discussing something unpleasant she had found on her shoe. Where other species develop beyond the need for organized violence, humans seem to embrace it. They glorify their warriors and celebrate their conflicts. Even their entertainment is filled with stories of combat and conquest. Jake felt something hot building in his chest. He had seen real combat, had held dying friends in his arms, had made decisions that kept him awake at night. War was not something humans enjoyed. It was something they endured, something they survived, something they did when there was no other choice. Around the room, other species were taking notes and nodding along with the instructor's words. A reptilian creature with scales that changed. Color was making soft clicking sounds that Jake had learned meant agreement. A floating jellyfish, like being pulsed with patterns of light that probably meant the same thing. Their emotional instability makes them unreliable partners, Zixtara went on, now showing brain scans that supposedly demonstrated human psychological problems. They form irrational attachments to individuals and groups outside their own species. This leads to poor decision-making and unpredictable behavior in crisis situations. That did it. Jake's chair scraped against the floor as he started to stand up, but Lisa's hand landed on his arm. Her grip was gentle but firm, and when he looked at her, she shook her head slightly. Not yet, her expression said. Wait. Jake settled back into his seat, but his whole body was tense like a coiled spring. Ben was watching him with concern, knowing his friend well enough to recognize the warning signs. Jake had always been slow to anger, but when he finally reached his limit, things happened fast. The lecture continued with more examples of human failings. Their short lifespans meant they made hasty decisions. Their diverse cultures led to constant internal conflicts. Their curiosity made them interfere in situations that did not concern them. Every human trait was twisted into a flaw. Every human achievement dismissed as primitive barbarism. Jake thought about the human colonies that had opened their doors to refugees from dying worlds. He thought about human scientists who had worked around the clock to develop cures for alien diseases. He thought about human ships that always answered distress calls. Regardless of which species was in trouble, none of that seemed to matter to Zixtara. In her view, humans were dangerous animals who had somehow stumbled into space travel. They were a problem to be managed, not partners to be welcomed, the instructor's voice droned on. But Jake was no longer really listening to the words. He was thinking about his options, about the consequences of speaking up, about whether it was worth the diplomatic incident that would surely follow. But as he looked around the room at the other species, all of them accepting this twisted version of humanity without question, Jake realized he did not have a choice. Someone had to speak up. Someone had to set the record straight, and apparently that someone was going to be him. Jake's patience finally snapped when Zixtara brought up the holographic display showing human military cemeteries. The images showed rows of white crosses and headstones, with the instructor's voice describing them as monuments to human violence and aggression. She gestured with two of her forearms while speaking, as if she was conducting some twisted orchestra. These burial grounds demonstrate the human obsession with death and warfare, Zixtara said, her musical voice dripping with disdain. No civilized species dedicates so much space and ceremony to celebrating their fallen warriors. It shows a fundamental inability to evolve beyond primitive tribal instincts. The heat in Jake's chest exploded into white-hot anger. Those were not monuments to violence. Those were memorials to sacrifice, to people who had died protecting others, to friends who would never come home. His own brother's name was carved into one of those stones. Killed in action while defending a colony of alien refugees. Jake stood up so fast his chair fell backward with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the lecture hall, causing dozens of alien heads to turn in his direction. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, trained by years of military command to project authority and demand attention. Ma'am, with all due respect, I think you might want to reconsider that assessment. The lecture hall went dead quiet. Even the soft humming of the air recycling system seemed to stop. Zixtara's 4 eyes focused on Jake like targeting systems locking onto a threat. Her blue skin seemed to darken, and all 4 of her arms moved to rest on the podium in front of her. "Ah, the primitive speaks," she said, her voice now cold instead of merely condescending. "Please enlighten us with your species' wisdom, assuming you possess any." Jake felt every eye in the room watching him. The reptilian creature with color changing. Scales had gone completely still, its skin now a cautious gray. The floating jellyfish being had stopped pulsing with light patterns. Even the insectoid delegates in the back row had stopped their constant hittring. Dr. Carter was staring at him with wide eyes, her face pale. Captain Parker had straightened in his seat, his military training kicking in as he prepared to back up his friend. But this was Jake's fight now, and he knew it. "I'm not here to defend every action my species has ever taken," Jake said, his voice steady and controlled. "But I'm here to correct some fundamental misunderstandings about what makes humans tick." Zixtara's laugh was like breaking glass. "Misunderstandings? I have studied your species for decades, human. I have access to your complete historical records, your psychological profiles, your cultural analyses. There is nothing about humanity that I do not already know." Jake took a step forward, his hands clasped behind his back in a military parade rest position. "Then you know that those cemeteries you just showed us? They're not celebrations of war. They're reminders of the cost of peace. Every name on those stones represents someone who died so that others could live safely." "Semantic games," Zixtara dismissed with a wave of one hand. "You glorify violence regardless of how you frame it, do we?" Jake asked. "Then explain why human art, literature, and entertainment focus so heavily on the aftermath of conflict rather than the conflict itself. Why our greatest stories are about people trying to avoid fighting, not seeking it out." The instructor's 4 arms gestured impatiently. "Your entertainment is filled with combat and conquest. Your movies celebrate warfare." Jake shook his head. "Our entertainment shows the horror of war and the value of peace. The heroes in our stories fight reluctantly, and they always pay a price for violence. We don't glorify war, we remember why it should be avoided." Around the room, some of the alien delegates were beginning to look uncertain. A few were whispering to each other in languages Jake could not understand. The reptilian creature's scales had shifted to a thoughtful yellow color. Zixtara seemed to sense that she was losing control of the situation. Her voice became sharper, more aggressive. "Your species has been in space for less than a century, and you have already been involved in 3 major conflicts. You cannot even maintain peace among your own kind, let alone with other species." "Those conflicts happened because humans were defending others," Jake replied. "The Zeta Reticuli border war started when human ships responded to distress calls from Betelgeuse colonies under attack. The Proxima incident began when human negotiators tried to prevent the Corvani from enslaving the Tau Ceti settlements. The Vega crisis happened because humans refused to abandon their alien allies when the situation got dangerous." Captain Parker nodded grimly from his seat. He had been there for 2 of those conflicts, had seen human ships charging into impossible odds to protect people they barely knew. "You prove my point," Zixtara said, her voice rising. "Humans involve themselves in conflicts that are none of their concern. This emotional instability makes them dangerous to galactic peace." Jake felt his anger cooling into something more focused and dangerous. "Emotional instability? You call it instability when humans risk their lives to protect strangers, when they share resources with struggling colonies, when they answer distress calls regardless of who's sending them?" "Yes," Zixtara said flatly. "Rational species calculate cost versus benefit. They protect their own interests first. Humans make decisions based on feelings rather than logic. And that's what you think makes us primitive. Among other things. Yes, Jake smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. Then I propose we put that theory to the test. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Zixthara's 4 eyes narrowed as she studied him, trying to determine if he was serious. What exactly are you suggesting, human? A challenge, Jake said simply. You believe humans are inferior to the advanced species in every way that matters. I believe you're wrong. Let's find out who's right. Dr. Carter half rose from her seat, alarm written across her face. Jake, what are you doing? But Jake kept his focus on the alien instructor. I'm willing to submit to whatever tests you think will prove your point about human inferiority. Intelligence, physical capability, moral reasoning, whatever you want. But if I succeed in these challenges, you publicly acknowledge that your assessment of humanity was wrong. Zixthara's skin seemed to shimmer with interest. And if you fail? Then you'll have proven your point in front of the entire class. Humanity will accept whatever restrictions the consortium thinks are necessary for our membership. The room erupted in shocked chittering, clicking, and warbling as the alien delegates realized what they were witnessing. This was not just an academic debate anymore. This was a formal challenge that could determine humanity's future in the galactic community. Captain Parker stood up slowly, his face grim. Jake, you don't have the authority to make that kind of deal. Jake glanced at his friend. I have the authority to defend my species' honor. The rest we'll figure out later. Zixthara was clearly delighted by this turn of events. All 4 of her arms moved expressively as she spoke, like she was conducting a celebration. Very well, human, I accept your challenge. But understand that I will design these tests to explore every aspect of your species' supposed superiority. When you fail, it will be completely and publicly. I understand, Jake said calmly. Then we begin immediately. The first test will be intellectual, a problem that requires the advanced cognitive abilities that humans supposedly lack. The second will be physical, a combat scenario that will demonstrate the superiority of evolved species over primitive warriors. The third will be moral, a test of judgment that will reveal the selfish nature hidden beneath human pretensions of nobility. Jake nodded. Sounds fair. Dr. Carter was frantically typing on her tablet, probably trying to send a message to Earth about what was happening. Captain Parker looked like he wanted to tackle Jake and drag him out of the room. But it was too late for second thoughts now. Zixthara's 4 eyes gleamed with anticipation. Prepare yourself, human. By the time I am finished with you, every species in this room will understand exactly why humanity should never have been allowed into space. Jake's smile was calm and confident. We'll see about that. The holographic display in front of Jake shimmered and changed, showing a complex 3-dimensional maze of equations, star charts, and quantum formulas. The symbols were alien, but his translation implant kicked in after a few seconds, making the text readable. What he saw made his stomach drop. Zixthara stood behind her podium with all 4 arms crossed, looking supremely confident. Your first test, human, is a problem that requires what we call advanced cognitive processing. You must calculate the optimal trajectory for a generational colony ship traveling from the Rigel system to the Aldebaran cluster, accounting for gravitational anomalies, quantum storm interference, and the degradation of the ship's protective systems over a journey of 300 years. Jake stared at the display, his mind racing. The math involved was staggering. He could see differential equations that would make a physics professor weep, stellar mechanics that required understanding of forces he had only read about in textbooks, and engineering calculations that seemed to need a supercomputer to solve. You have 1 hour, Zixthara continued, her musical voice filled with satisfaction. The Corvani delegation attempted this same problem last month and required their entire mathematical council working together to find a solution. I am curious to see how a primitive human brain handles such complexity. The reptilian creature with color-changing scales had shifted to a deep purple that Jake had learned meant amusement. The floating jellyfish being was pulsing with rapid light patterns that seemed to indicate excitement. Even the insectoid delegates were chittering more loudly. As if they were placing bets on how quickly Jake would fail, Dr. Carter leaned forward. In her seat, her face pale. She was brilliant, one of the best xenobiologists Earth had ever produced, but this was way beyond her expertise. Captain Parker looked like he was watching a friend walk into an ambush with no backup. Jake took a deep breath and stepped closer to the display. The equations floated in the air around him, three-dimensional and interactive. He could reach out and manipulate them with his hands, rotating formulas and adjusting variables. It was impressive technology, but right now it felt like a death trap. The first thing Jake noticed was that the problem was designed to be solved in a very specific way. There were established formulas for every variable, tried and tested methods that had been used by spacefaring civilizations for thousands of years. The Altarians and their allies had turned space travel into a precise science with equations for every possible situation, but Jake was not an Altarian. He was human. And humans had a different way of looking at problems. Instead of diving into the complex mathematics, Jake stepped back and studied the problem as a whole. He ignored the intimidating equations and focused on what was actually being asked. A colony ship needed to get from point A to point B safely, with limited resources and multiple obstacles in the way. Interesting approach, Zixtara said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Are you planning to solve this problem or simply stare at it until it goes away? Jake did not respond. He was thinking about a lesson from his military training, something his old sergeant used to say, when you're facing a complex problem, strip away everything that doesn't matter and focus on what does. What mattered here was not the precise mathematical optimization that the alien races preferred. What mattered was getting the colonists to their destination alive and with enough resources to build a new home. Everything else was just details. Jake reached out and began manipulating the holographic display, but not in the way Zixtara expected. Instead of working through the established formulas, he started changing the basic assumptions of the problem itself. What are you doing? The instructor demanded, her forearms moving in agitation. Solving the problem? Jake replied calmly. Just not the way you expected. The traditional solution assumed that the colony ship would travel in a straight line from Rigel to Aldebaran, using massive amounts of energy to push through or around every obstacle. It was brute force engineering, relying on superior technology and computational power to overcome any challenge. Jake's approach was different. Instead of fighting the obstacles, he worked with them. He plotted a course that used the gravitational anomalies as slingshots, turning problems into advantages. Where the traditional solution saw quantum storms as barriers to be avoided, Jake saw them as energy sources that could be harvested to supplement the ship's power systems. Most importantly, Jake rejected the assumption that the ship's protective systems would simply degrade over time. Instead, he incorporated a maintenance and upgrade schedule that would actually improve the ship's capabilities during the journey, using resources gathered along the way. That is not how stellar navigation works, Zixtara protested, her blue skin darkening with frustration. It's how human navigation works, Jake replied, his hands moving confidently through the holographic interface. We don't have the luxury of overwhelming technological superiority, so we learn to be creative. Around the room, the alien delegates were beginning to pay closer attention. The reptilian creature's scales had shifted to a curious orange color. The floating jellyfish being's light patterns had slowed to a more thoughtful rhythm. Even the insectoid chittering had quieted down. Jake's solution was taking shape in the holographic display, and it was nothing like what anyone expected. Instead of a single massive colony ship pushing through space by brute force, Jake had designed a modular system that could adapt to changing conditions. The ship would arrive at Aldebaran not weakened by the journey, but stronger and more capable than when it left Rigel. Your mathematics are wrong, Zixtara said, but there was less confidence in her voice now. You cannot simply ignore the established principles of stellar mechanics. Jake smiled. I'm not ignoring them. I'm using them differently. He gestured to a section of his solution that dealt with the quantum storms. Your people see these as obstacles because they disrupt normal space travel, but humans have been dealing with storms for thousands of years. We learned to use wind patterns to sail faster, not just to avoid bad weather. The instructor's 4 eyes narrowed as she studied Jake's work. She was clearly looking for flaws, for some obvious mistake. That would prove the human's inferiority. But as minutes passed, her expression grew more and more troubled. "This is not possible," she muttered, her musical voice losing its confident tone. "The energy requirements alone should make this solution impossible." Jake pointed to another section of his display. "Only if you assume that energy can only be stored and spent, never created or recycled. Humans have been working with closed-loop systems for decades. We know how to make resources stretch further than they should." Dr. Carter was leaning forward now, her scientific mind engaged despite her worry. She could see what Jake was doing, and her eyes were bright with understanding. Captain Parker was grinning, recognizing the same kind of creative problem-solving that had gotten them out of tight spots during their military service. Jake made a final adjustment to his solution and stepped back. The holographic display now showed a complete trajectory plan that was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Not only would the colony ship reach Aldebaran safely, but it would arrive with more resources than it had started with and the capability to begin terraforming immediately. "Time," Jake announced. Even though he still had 20 minutes left on the clock, Zixtara studied the display in silence, her 4 arms moving as she ran calculations in her head. The other alien delegates were whispering among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of clicks, chirps, and warbles. Finally, the instructor spoke. "Your solution is unusual, but the mathematics appear to be sound." She paused, clearly reluctant to admit what came next. "In fact, your approach would result in a journey time 30% shorter than the traditional method, with significantly lower resource consumption." Jake nodded calmly. Sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem is to change the problem itself. The lecture hall was buzzing with conversation now. The reptilian creature's scales had shifted to a bright yellow that Jake had learned meant excitement. The floating jellyfish being was pulsing with rapid, complex light patterns. Even the insectoid delegates were chittering in what sounded like approval. Zixtara's blue skin had darkened to an almost navy color, which Jake guessed meant she was not happy. "Very well, human, you have passed the first test. But intelligence alone does not make a species suitable for galactic society. Physical capability and combat effectiveness are equally important." Jake felt a surge of confidence. The first test had been designed to showcase human weakness, but it had instead demonstrated human strength. He was beginning to understand that Zixtara's entire assessment of humanity was based on comparing humans to other species using alien standards. But humans did not succeed by being better aliens. They succeeded by being better humans. "I'm ready." "For the second test," Jake said, his voice steady and confident. Zixtara's 4 eyes gleamed with malicious anticipation. "We shall see how ready you truly are, human. The next challenge will test your species' supposed warrior capabilities against a true combat system. I have selected an opponent that has defeated every other species that has attempted this test." The combat arena materialized around Jake in a flash of blue light, and suddenly he was standing on metal flooring with walls that stretched up into darkness. The air was thick and humid, making his uniform stick to his skin. Red lights pulsed along the walls in a rhythm that reminded him of a heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the sound of machinery humming. Jake looked around carefully, taking in every detail. There were weapons racks scattered throughout the arena, each one containing unfamiliar alien technology. Strange obstacles jutted up from the floor at odd angles, creating a maze of hiding spots and potential traps. The whole place felt like it had been designed by someone who enjoyed watching other people suffer. "Your opponent will be a Corvani warrior drone," Zixtara's voice echoed from speakers hidden in the walls. The Corvani are the finest warriors in the galaxy, bred for combat over thousands of generations. Their warrior drones are mechanical copies of their greatest fighters, programmed with the combat knowledge of their entire species. Jake nodded, his military training kicking in automatically. He began moving toward the nearest weapon rack, keeping his back to the wall and his eyes scanning for threats. The weapons looked like nothing he had ever seen before, curved blades that hummed with energy, projectile weapons that seemed to bend light around them, and devices that he could not even begin to identify. The Corvani have never lost a single combat engagement, Zixtara continued, her voice filled with satisfaction. They have tested themselves against every warrior species in the galaxy and emerged victorious every time. Their reflexes are faster than human thought, their strength is triple that of your species, and their combat programming contains 10,000 years of tactical knowledge. Jake picked up something that looked like it might be a rifle, though it was shaped all wrong and had too many buttons. The weight felt strange in his hands, and when he tried to find a trigger, the weapon made a soft, beeping sound and shut itself off. Apparently it was biologically locked to specific species. The drone you will face has already defeated representatives from 12 different species in this same arena, Zixtara went on. The Beetlejuice shock troopers lasted 47 seconds. The Proxima Battle Masters managed 1 minute and 12 seconds. The longest any opponent has survived was 3 minutes and 18 seconds, achieved by a Rigel combat specialist who was considered unbeatable by his own people. Jake abandoned the alien weapons and moved deeper into the arena. If the technology was designed to reject him, he would have to find another way. That was fine. Humans had been fighting with improvised weapons for thousands of years before they ever saw their first alien rifle. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the arena, and Jake felt his pulse quicken. Somewhere in the maze of obstacles, his opponent was moving. The footsteps were perfectly regular, like a machine walking, which made sense since that was exactly what it was. Jake found a piece of metal pipe that had broken off from one of the obstacles and hefted in his hands. It was about 3 feet long and had a good weight to it. Not much against a warrior drone with 10,000 years of combat programming, but it was better than nothing. Begin, Zixtara announced, and suddenly the arena was filled with the sound of something large moving very fast. The Corvani warrior drone appeared around a corner like a nightmare made real. It was humanoid but wrong, with too many joints and limbs that bent in directions that hurt to look at. Its skin was metallic gray, and its eyes glowed red in the dim light of the arena. It carried 2 curved blades that sparked with electric energy, and it moved with a fluid grace that was somehow more terrifying than clumsy brutality would have been. Jake did not try to meet it head-on. Instead, he dove behind the nearest obstacle as the drone's blades carved through the air where his head had been a second before. The creature was fast, faster than anything human, but Jake had not survived 3 wars by trying to out-muscle superior opponents. The drone pursued him relentlessly, its blades leaving glowing trails in the air as it struck again and again. Jake stayed mobile, using the obstacles to break line of sight and force the creature to constantly adjust its attack patterns. He was not trying to win yet. He was studying his opponent, learning its habits and limitations. After 2 minutes of desperate running and dodging, Jake began to notice patterns. The drone was incredibly skilled, but it fought like a machine. Its attacks were perfect but predictable, following optimal combat algorithms that assumed rational opponents who would respond in logical ways. But Jake was not fighting logically. He was fighting like a human, which meant he was fighting dirty. The next time the drone cornered him, Jake did something that apparently was not in its programming. Instead of trying to block or dodge the creature's attack, he threw his metal pipe at its head and then dove between its legs, rolling to safety while it dealt with the unexpected projectile. The drone paused for just a fraction of a second, its red eyes flickering as it processed this new data. That tiny hesitation told Jake everything he needed to know. The machine was programmed to fight warriors, not survivors. Jake began implementing every dirty trick he had learned in 3 wars. And a dozen bar fights. He threw sand in the drone's optical sensors. He used the arena's own obstacles against it, causing it to crash into walls when he suddenly changed direction. He even grabbed one of the alien weapons and threw it at the creature's legs, not trying to fire it but using it as a projectile. To disrupt its balance, most importantly, Jake started talking. The drone was programmed to process audio input for tactical communication, but it was not prepared for a running commentary delivered in the middle of combat. You know what your problem is? Jake called out as he rolled under another energy. Blade strike. You fight like you're supposed to win. Humans fight like they're supposed to survive. The drone's response was to increase its attack speed, its blades moving so fast they were just blurs of light. But Jake was no longer where the machine expected him to be. He had learned to read its attack patterns, and more importantly, he had learned to think like something the drone could not predict. The Kovani bred you to be perfect warriors, Jake continued, using a broken piece of machinery to vault over an obstacle while the drone's blade sparked against metal behind him. But perfect warriors fight other warriors. They don't fight? Desperate humans who are too stupid to know when they're beaten. 3 minutes passed, then 4. In the lecture hall, Jake could hear alien voices talking excitedly. He had already lasted longer than anyone else, but he was not trying to set records, he was trying to win. The breakthrough came when Jake realized that the drone's perfect tactical programming was also its weakness. It was designed to counter every known fighting style in the galaxy, which meant it was reactive rather than creative. It responded to threats instead of creating them. Jake stopped running and started hunting, using the arena's layout to his advantage. Jake began herding the drone toward a specific section where several of the weapon racks had been damaged. Broken alien technology lay scattered across the floor. Creating a hazardous obstacle course that required careful footing, the drone followed him without hesitation, its tactical programming recognizing an attempt to gain positional advantage, but confident in its ability to maintain superiority regardless of terrain. What it did not recognize was Jake's true intention. When the drone closed to striking distance, Jake did something that violated every principle of rational combat. Instead of defending himself, he grabbed onto the creature's weapon arm and held on tight, using his body weight to throw both of them toward the largest pile of broken machinery. The drone's superior strength meant it could have easily thrown Jake off, but its programming prioritized maintaining weapon control over positioning. It tried to complete its attack sequence while dealing with the unexpected grapple, which meant it was not prepared when they both crashed into the wreckage. Jake rolled away as sparks flew from damaged alien technology. The drone was tangled in the wreckage but not seriously damaged, until Jake grabbed a heavy piece of broken machinery and brought it down on the creature's head with all the strength he could muster. The drone's red eyes flickered and went dark. The arena fell silent except for the sound of Jake's heavy breathing. Combat simulation complete, Zixtara's voice announced, but there was no satisfaction in her tone now. Time elapsed. 7 minutes and 43 seconds. Opponent defeated. Jake stood up slowly, his uniform torn and his face bloody from a dozen small cuts. He looked up at where he knew the cameras were watching and smiled. Round 2 goes to the humans, he said. In the lecture hall, the alien delegates were talking loudly among themselves. The reptilian creature's scales had shifted to a bright gold color that Jake had learned meant extreme surprise. The floating jellyfish being was pulsing with complex light, patterns that seemed to indicate confusion and respect, but Jake was not done yet. He knew that Zixtara would have one more test, and he suspected it would be the hardest one of all. Physical and intellectual challenges could be overcome with skill and creativity, but moral tests were different. They went to the heart of what it meant to be human, and that was exactly where Jake wanted to fight. Jake found himself back in the lecture hall, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The alien delegates who had been dismissive and bored 3 hours ago were now watching him with what looked like respect and curiosity. The reptilian creature's scales were still that bright gold color of surprise, and the floating jellyfish being had moved closer to get a better look at him. Zixtara stood at her podium, all 4 of her arms rigid with frustration. Her blue skin had darkened to an almost black color, which Jake was beginning to understand meant she was very angry. She had designed 2 tests specifically to prove human inferiority, and Jake had not just passed them but had done so in ways that made her precious advanced species look foolish. "Congratulations, human," she said, her musical voice now sharp with barely controlled rage. "You have proven that your species possesses a certain primitive cunning. But intelligence and combat ability mean nothing without moral character, and that is where your kind will finally reveal its true nature." Jake walked slowly back to his seat, his torn uniform and bloody face drawing stares from every alien in the room. Dr. Carter reached out to touch his arm as he sat down, her eyes wide with concern and pride. Captain Parker was grinning like a man watching his favorite team win the championship. "The final test," Zixthara continued, "will examine what we consider the most important quality for any species seeking membership in the Galactic Consortium, the ability to make proper moral judgments under pressure." The holographic display flickered to life again, but this time it showed something that made Jake's stomach clench. It was a space station, clearly damaged and venting atmosphere. Emergency lights were flashing, and he could see tiny figures moving around in what looked like panic. "The scenario is simple," Zixthara explained, her voice returning to that cold, clinical tone. "You are the captain of a rescue ship responding to a distress call. The station you see is about to suffer catastrophic failure that will kill everyone. Aboard, you have time to save only one group of survivors." The display zoomed in to show 2 different sections of the station. In one section, Jake could see 5 figures in what looked like military uniforms. They were armed and appeared to be trying to maintain order in the chaos. In the other section, he could see what looked like hundreds of civilian figures, men, women, and children huddled together in a large compartment. "The 5 armed individuals are members of your own species," Zixthara said. "They are trained professionals with valuable skills and experience. The larger group consists of civilians from a species you have never encountered before. They have no special training, no particular value to your mission, and no connection to your people." Jake studied the scenario carefully, but he already felt a sick certainty about where this was going. Around the room, the alien delegates were leaning forward with interest. This was clearly a test that every species had faced, and apparently most of them had failed in Zixthara's eyes. "Every rational species chooses to save their own people," the instructor continued. "It is logical, efficient, and demonstrates proper priority systems. The few that choose the larger group do so based on simple mathematical calculation. More lives saved equals better outcome. Both responses show the kind of logical thinking that advanced civilizations require." Jake looked at the display for another long moment, then stood up. "What kind of ship am I commanding? What are its capabilities? How much time do I have exactly? What kind of failure is the station experiencing?" Zixthara's 4 eyes narrowed. "Those details are irrelevant to the moral choice you must make." "Are they?" Jake asked. "Because the first thing any human ship captain would do is look for a third option." "There is no third option," Zixthara said firmly. "The scenario parameters are fixed. You must choose between saving 5 of your own people or saving hundreds of strangers." Jake smiled, and it was the same calm, confident expression he had worn before dismantling her previous 2 tests. "You're assuming I accept the scenario as presented. But humans have a saying, never leave a man behind. We also have another saying, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. You've created a situation where following either principle means abandoning the other." "Exactly," Zixthara said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "You cannot save both groups. You must choose, and that choice will reveal the true nature of human morality." Jake shook his head. "The problem with this test is that it assumes there are only 2 options. But humans don't accept no-win scenarios. We change the rules of the game." Before Zixthara could object, Jake began manipulating the holographic interface with the same confidence he had shown during the first test. But instead of working within the established parameters, he started examining the underlying assumptions of the scenario itself. "You said the station is suffering catastrophic failure," Jake said as he pulled up technical displays. But you didn't specify what kind of failure. If it's a power core overload, the timeline is different than if it's structural collapse. If it's life support failure, that's different again. The type of failure is irrelevant, Zixthara protested. No, it's not, Jake replied, his hands moving rapidly through the interface, because different failures have different solutions. And you said I'm commanding a rescue ship, but you didn't specify what kind of ship or what equipment it carries. Jake found what he was looking for in the scenario's technical specifications. Like the previous tests, this one was designed with certain assumptions about how it would be approached. Those assumptions were about to be proven wrong. According to the parameters you've set up, I'm commanding a standard consortium rescue vessel, Jake said, highlighting information on the display. That means I have industrial fabricators, emergency life support pods, and a full engineering crew. More importantly, I have something that every human ship carries: redundant safety systems designed by people who refuse to accept that some situations are hopeless. Zixthara was beginning to look alarmed. You cannot simply change the scenario to avoid making a choice. I'm not changing the scenario, Jake replied calmly. I'm solving the problem. There's a difference. What Jake had discovered in the technical specifications was that the space station's failure was caused by a cascade overload in its power distribution system. The traditional response would be to evacuate as many people as possible before the station exploded. But humans had dealt with similar problems before, and they had developed creative solutions. Instead of choosing which group to save, Jake began implementing a repair protocol that would stabilize the station's power grid long enough to evacuate everyone. It required using his ship's own power core as a buffer, redirecting energy flows through jury-rigged connections, and having his engineering crew perform repairs in a radiation-flooded environment. This is not possible, Zixthara said, her forearms waving frantically. The scenario does not allow for station repairs. The scenario allows for whatever equipment and personnel I have available, Jake replied. And humans never go anywhere without the tools to fix things that are broken. Around the room, the alien delegates were watching with fascination. This was clearly not how the test usually went. The reptilian creature's scales had shifted to a pattern of gold and green that seemed to indicate excitement. Mixed with confusion, Jake's solution was taking shape on the holographic display. Instead of a choice between two groups of people, the scenario now showed a complex but achievable rescue operation that would save everyone on the station. It would be dangerous and would require split-second timing, but it was possible. Even if your repair plan works, Zixthara said desperately, it would put your own crew at enormous risk. No rational captain would endanger his people for strangers. Jake looked at her with something like pity. That's where you're wrong about? Humans, we don't consider anyone strangers once they're in trouble. The moment we received that distress call, everyone on that station became our responsibility. Dr. Carter was staring at Jake's solution with her mouth open. As a scientist, she could see that the plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Captain. Parker was nodding approvingly. He had seen Jake pull off similar impossible rescues during their military service. This is not how the test is supposed to work, Zixthara said, her voice rising to something close to panic. Maybe that's the problem with the test, Jake replied. You're so focused on forcing people to choose between bad options that you never considered the possibility of creating good options. Jake made a final adjustment to his solution and stepped back. The display now showed a complete rescue plan that would save every person on the station while minimizing risk to the rescue crew. It was complex and would require perfect coordination, but it was achievable. The human approach to moral dilemmas, Jake explained to the room full of aliens, is not to choose the least terrible option. It's to refuse to accept that terrible options are the only ones available. The lecture hall was completely silent. Even Zixthara seemed stunned by what she was seeing. Jake walked back toward his seat, but he stopped at the front of the room and turned to address the entire class. You want to know what makes humans different? It's not our intelligence or our fighting ability. It's our absolute refusal to accept that some people can't be saved.